Morning, everyone. Good afternoon, Riccardo. It's my pleasure today to welcome Riccardo Mastini, who is a PhD student and researcher in ecological economics and political economy at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He is a policy advisor for the International Campaign for a Green New Deal for Europe. So the connection to this studio should be very clear to everyone, given our focus on the Green New Deal, both here and in Europe and in the UK and elsewhere. He's also an expert reviewer for the IPCC6 assessment report. He's also a member of the academic group called Research and Degrowth, and hopefully we'll hear more about this today, and of the International Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Riccardo previously worked as a campaigner at Friends of the Earth Europe and as a consultant advising international environmental organizations and governmental agencies. He was also the lead author on the paper that everyone read for today, which raises a number of critical issues that underlie the Green New Deal and degrowth movements. So it's my real pleasure today to welcome Riccardo to the SuperStudio, and I look forward to an engaging conversation today. Riccardo, thank you for joining us, and I'll pass the Zoom mic over to you.
Thanks, Ralph, and good day, everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you today. And I was very pleased by all the questions that you raised concerning the paper we recently authored, and I'll try to give an overview first of some concepts which I consider essential for understanding the Green New Deal narrative, and then I will argue why I think that in order to be successful in addressing the climate crisis, it should be grounded in degrowth. I will not repeat, I would try at least not to repeat the concepts that I explained in the paper. So I'll focus a bit more on the politics around the Green New Deal. And of course, as you all know, the concept itself was born in the US a couple of years ago. So for me, it's very interesting to engage with students from the US, since you have a better first-hand experience of how the discourse around the Green New Deal has been evolving since then. As you of course all know, the name Green New Deal is a reference to the original New Deal, which was a series of social programs, labor reforms, and public work projects that were implemented to get the US out of the Great Depression. And indeed, these, I think, are the constitutive elements of the Green New Deal. So the reference is quite on point. The whole idea of the Green New Deal is to bring the state back into the economy, to give it an active role in shaping a new political economy. So rather than substituting the private sector in innovating, it's rather trying to harness the power of the private sector, but then to coordinate it in order to overhaul the productive system and the infrastructural system of the country to make it carbon neutral. This is a considerable point of break from the neoliberal dogma that has reigned over the last 30 years. And the central assumption of the Green New Deal is that the ecological crisis is part of a wider social crisis caused by unbridled capitalism. And therefore, the Green New Deal proponents try to solve this crisis, this double crisis, through redistributing economic and political power rather than merely through market mechanisms. So if we accepted that the ecological crisis is a colossal failure of the free market, then the first step is to recognize the need for public interventions that go beyond the simple modification of prices, such as through carbon taxes or subsidies for green technologies, and instead adopt public interventions that impose strict limits on emissions, so what is usually referred to as command and control or regulation, and also by financing and coordinating directly public works that are essential for an infrastructural transformation. So the idea is that we cannot content ourselves with a microeconomic approach to address the ecological crisis. What we actually need is a new political economy. So the politics, I think, surrounding this kind of economic argument is that we should not focus on individual lifestyles, which run the risk of courting elitism and therefore alienate the majority of citizens, but rather present the ecological transition as fundamentally a collective issue and therefore political. In essence, we can say that the Green New Deal framework operates by constantly delivering and broadcasting tangible quality of life improvements for the majority of citizens, while transforming the way we produce, consume, and live. This is why one of the key proposals is to reduce economic inequality. This is because income is by far the most important determinant of environmental impact. It doesn't matter how green the rich think they are. The truth is that if you have surplus money, you end up spending it. And in doing so, you increase your ecological footprint. Attitudes have little bearing on the amount of transport fuel, home energy, and other materials that citizens consume. And data show that energy footprint grow with expenditure and therefore is unequally distributed in our society and is increasingly unequally distributed given the fact that economic inequality has been growing over the last few decades. So this is one of the dimensions, let's say, of the environmental justice at the core of the Green New Deal, and the reverse side of it, if you will, the other face of the coin is that while there is a direct relationship between wealth and personal emissions, there is an inverse relationship between wealth and vulnerability to ecological, for example, extreme weather events. Therefore, the poorer you are, the less responsible you are for generating the climate crisis, but the more exposed and vulnerable you are to it. Therefore, there is this double dimension, you may call it this double form of injustice that makes the fairness aspect, the beating heart of the political proposal of the Green New Deal. So the idea is that the vulnerable communities, marginalized communities that are the least responsible for the climate crisis should receive support in navigating an age of increased economic and environmental vulnerability. And this can, for example, be done by expanding the welfare system. So if we think, how do we approach then this economic inequality that is at the core of environmental injustice? Well, we have, of course, to operate, for example, through the taxation system, but we should be aware of using a direct form of taxation, such as carbon taxation, because a carbon-centric approach, let's say, so focusing just on the molecule of carbon, can disproportionately impact lower income families who spend a larger share of their income on fuel and on electricity. So using this financial lever is significantly less effective in unequal countries since the affluent, the wealthy, tend to be immune to price signals, given the fact that, of course, they have more disposable income. So the idea is that carbon taxation does not need to be ditched entirely, but rather we need to reprioritize the way we use taxation to transform the way we consume. So first of all, we should reduce inequality in our society. First of all, because we know that the more equal a society is, the lower the average carbon footprint per capita is. But also because A less unequal society is also a society in which there is a less positional consumption. So the kind of purchasing decisions that are not made to satisfy actual needs of the people, but rather just to acquire status signifiers. So kind of goods that just perform the task of proving our social position, so to speak. So before taxing carbon, we must beef up public services in order to provide people with alternative ways of meeting their essential needs. I think a case study coming from Europe is the Yellow Vest protest that rocked France over a couple of years ago, because the tax hikes that were decided by the government in order to reduce the amount of private driving that people would do backfired a big time, since people took to the streets, because many people who were living in peri-urban areas were dependent on their cars, not of their choice, but rather because there were no public services around them, and therefore they were forced to drive long distances in order to go to their workplace, or to drive their children to school, or to access supermarkets or health facilities. So the idea here is that those people had a high carbon footprint, not because they were wealthy and they were buying sport cars and driving for fun, but rather because they were too poor to decide how to live their lives. They didn't have a choice of moving to live in the city center so that everything was a walking distance. Therefore, I think this is a cautionary tale that we should bear in mind when we think of just using taxation to nudge people's behaviors, because in such an unequal society in which carbon-intense infrastructures are the lifeline for many marginalized communities, we first need to think how to provide alternatives, public, free at the point of service alternatives. And once we have done that, then we can try indeed to use the taxation to sway people's consumption choices. So this, I think, makes quite obvious the reason why so many Green New Deal proponents argue that climate change is essentially class struggle. The idea is that the ecological transformation we should embrace centers on the material conditions that that working class people face in their daily lives. It's essentially about the way we move, the way we heat our homes, or the kind of energy that we purchase to power our homes. So the Green New Deal rightly centers on sectors like housing, energy, food, and transport, and claims that we can both decarbonize and decommodify these sectors to create a better lives for the vast majority of people. And to decarbonize the way we move, what we eat, how we supply energy and heating to our homes, we should remove basic services from the market logic and subject them to the logic of the commons. So one important reason why decommodification and decarbonization should proceed in lockstep is because the consumption of public alternatives has a lower environmental impact than their private equivalents. And this is also crucial, as I was saying, to reduce the dependence on individual consumer goods that drive a status competition and also cause people to have a higher ecological footprint than if they had access to public infrastructures. Of course, this decommodification of essential public services can be facilitated by a model of public ownership. The fact is that if we want to introduce fares for example, for electricity distribution or access to public housing or to public transportation, in order to make this a political decision and merely a market decision, well, then the ownership of these essential infrastructures should be public, so that it's not subject to a profit logic. And this is the reason why most of the investments in green infrastructures are still bankrolled by by governments, by the public purse. The International Energy Agency recently released this statistic saying that 70% of investment in renewable energy sectors worldwide come from the public. And this should not come as a surprise, because this kind of infrastructure investment usually bring returns only long term, and usually the rate of returns is less than what the private sector expect. So there is much more appetite in investing in for example, stock buybacks than in investing in this kind of infrastructural overhaul, which by its own very nature is a kind of public good. And historically, governments have provided for this kind of public goods. All kind of infrastructural development usually has been government-led. And this is, first of all, for economic reasons, as I was trying to explain, because the government can finance them at much better rates, and it doesn't have to recoup on its investment with the same kind of profit margins that the private sector has, but also because it's essential to have a kind of coordination across infrastructure. And this is why, just as it was the case with the railroads, highway systems, sewage systems at the beginning of the 20th century, now the low carbon infrastructure we need to put in place is the kind of public good that the government, the public sector is expected to provide. Also because it's not an exclusionary good that can be easily appropriated and therefore marketed. Rather, once it's in place, it tends to be of advantage to all businesses and citizens, and therefore it's difficult to monetize out of it. And this is the reason why, for example, more and more municipalities around the world are bringing their sewage system, water system, energy system, and public transportation system back under public control. Actually, there was a very interesting report recently published by the Transnational Institute based in Amsterdam, which traces 1,400 cases all over the world where private services have been remunicipalized to be brought under local control in order to make them more efficient, transparent, sustainable. So this is the basic idea of the Green New Deal. That I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Now, in the remaining 10 minutes of my opening remarks, I wanted to argue why I think that in order to be successful, a Green New Deal needs to move beyond the ideology of growth and therefore be grounded in a post-growth economic model. So to better understand this, I think it's important to start from a figure that sets the scene for the kind of conversation we should be having. And the figure is that if the global economy continues to grow at the usual rate of 2-3% per year, then in the next 30 years, the world will consume as much energy and raw materials as we did cumulatively over the past 10,000 years. This is the madness of compound growth. In the next 30 years, if we follow the current trajectory of compound growth, we are going to consume as much energy and raw materials as we did cumulatively over basically the previous history of civilization. So once we understand this, it's pretty obvious that we need to find a way out of this. But to try and be more specific, I'll try to explain why trying to decarbonize the energy system while growing it is like walking towards the line of the horizon trying to reach it. In reality, it constantly recedes from you. And the fact is that the more, of course, the energy system grows, the harder it is to decarbonize it. And this is the reason why, for example, rather than speaking of an energy transition, we should be speaking of an energy addition, in the sense that most of the renewable energy that we are bringing into the system is not currently displacing fossil fuels. Rather, it's just being added on top. For instance, at the global level, since the year 2000, we have been producing 8 billion more megawatt hours of clean energy every year. Okay, so since the year 2000, we have indeed been increasing at a staggering rate the amount of renewable energy that we have been producing. But in the very same period of time, the overall energy system has, global energy system has grown by 48 billion megawatt hours. So 8 billion hours of renewable energy against the 48 billion, 48 billion megawatt hours of total energy increase. Therefore, all the renewable energy that we have brought into the system since the year 2000 has just covered a little share of total energy growth. So while it's being difficult to decarbonize the energy system at its current size, it's going to prove to be nearly impossible to do it if we keep on growing it at the rate that I was discussing before. If we were to continue on this trajectory, we would find ourselves to have to achieve rates of decarbonization around 12–14% per year, especially in global north countries that have a moral duty of decarbonizing their economies faster than the rest of the world. And we know that these rates of decarbonization, so 12–14% per year, are beyond all kind of best optimistic estimates that the scientists say are achievable. This is the reason why I think we need to downshift, to downscale our social metabolism, and which is basically composed of the energy and raw materials that we use as input in order to power our economy, and that we spit out as waste. We need to downscale this social metabolism, but doing so doesn't necessarily mean foregoing a good quality of life for citizens. And the truth is that the interventions that matter when it comes to improving human welfare do not require high levels of GDP. And the proof of that is the European Union as a whole, so the entire economic union, as 36% less income than the United States. And yet it beats the US not only on life expectancy, but virtually on all indicators of human welfare. So basically 1/3 less GDP per capita, and yet all kinds of human development indicators are higher in the EU. But what is most staggering is that there are countries that are usually defined as developing countries that manage to achieve high levels of human welfare with low GDP per capita. An example among many is the case of Costa Rica, which surpasses the United States on many welfare indicators, with a GDP per capita that is only 1/7 that of the US. At this point, you may wonder, what explains such remarkable results? How is it possible that other countries are able to improve human welfare with less GDP per capita? Well, the fact is that when it comes to delivering long, healthy, flourishing lives for all, what counts is investing in high-quality, universal public services, which are significantly more cost-efficient and more ecologically efficient to run than their private counterparts. Proof of that is that, for example, the NHS, the British National Health Service, if we look at for every unit of dollar spent in the NHS, we realize that it has a much lower carbon footprint than an equivalent that is spent in a privatized healthcare system. This is because of economies of scale, better coordination, less useless kind of medical operations, checkups that are done just to charge patients. So there is a variety of reasons why managing these as public goods is better than managing them as market commodities. However, the truth is that since the 80s, endless waves of privatization on education, healthcare, transportation, housing have been unleashed, especially in the West. And so social goods everywhere, including in Europe, are under attack. And I argued that this is a purposeful strategy. The idea is that by making public goods artificially scarce, people will have no choice but to purchase private alternatives, meaning that citizens end up paying to acquire goods that they used to access for free. And what happens when you enclose a good that used to be accessed for free? Well, GDP grows. GDP grows because money changes hands. And basically, by enclosing public goods and forcing people to purchase private alternatives, you are creating the kind of artificial scarcity, right? This artificial scarcity in the sense that those public goods are still there, the hospitals are still there, but rather than being administered as a common or as a public good, they are administered as commodities. So you are enclosing and preventing access unless the customer can pay for access to these services. So in a way, scarcity, this kind of artificial scarcity and growth, create a self-reinforcing loop, right? So to stimulate growth, you need to enclose public goods, because if you enclose these public goods, people need to purchase them, and money changes hands, and GDP grows. So this kind of enclosure favors GDP growth. But at the same time, there is also a self-reinforcing loop going in the opposite direction, in the sense that if you enclose these public goods, then citizens are hooked on a growing economy, since their ability to access these essential services for life are determined on the economy providing them with a job, their wages increasing. And so everybody rallies around the mantra of growthism. Everybody wants growth because their own life, their own survival depends on it. But what I would like to argue in the last minute of my opening remarks is that if scarcity is created for the sake of growth, as I just argued, then by reversing this kind of artificial scarcity, we can render growth unnecessary. So what I mean to say is that if we de-enclose and expand the commons, so if we de-enclose these public services and we treat them as commons, then we can enable people to access these essential goods that they need to live well, without forcing them to have high levels of income and therefore additional growth at the aggregate level. So people would be able to work less and have without any loss of their quality of life. It is true that the economy would be smaller in terms of GDP, and yet it would be more abundant in terms of welfare. So in a way, we can say that the growth calls for abundance, for this kind of common public abundance, to make growth unnecessary. So to get people basically off the hook of a constantly growing economy. I'll leave it at that.
Well, Riccardo, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we could probably talk for hours about all of the issues you've raised, and hopefully we can have you back as a guest again in the SuperStudio. I think one of the things that we could touch on in the future are the nuances and differences between the different versions of Green New Deals around the world, and how they connect with degrowth. And I think that the bridging paper you wrote between looking at Green New Deal growth and degrowth, I think is a very important contribution to this discussion. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone here for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
We look forward to hopefully future engagements.
I look forward to it too.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.